Hello class, welcome to the next lecture on the 1970s. As I talked about previously, the 60s don't end on the best note. It's not as bad as the 20s, the other big party decade of the century. We don't have a Great Depression taking over the country and the entire world. But there is a significant depression that happens in the 70s, and you're going to hear it very clearly in the music. Let's go over some of those things that put an end to the party of the late 60s, the summer of love, and the psychedelic rock revolution. First, we have the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. We have Charles Manson, where the idea of a loving hippie commune becomes murderous. We have Altamont, where the idea of a free-form musical festival with peace, love, and understanding turns into a nightmare where people are beaten and one concertgoer dies. We have the election of Richard Nixon, which indicates that the country is moving in a more conservative direction now. Janis Joplin dies, Jim Morrison dies, Jimi Hendrix dies, the Beatles break up in 1970. And psychedelic rock is going to disappear. And perhaps most importantly, we have the Vietnam War, things going very poorly there, and the United States actually loses that war. Those pretty much put an end to the psychedelic rock movement and the summer of love, and many of these baby boomers that were 18 to 21, 22, 23 at the time start to enter the real world. They maybe have left college and now they have to start to find jobs. And what we're going to hear in the music of the 1970s is a sense of nostalgia and loss. The music will be dark, ominous, slow tempos, long songs, and heavy. Unfortunately, the 70s don't start out a whole lot better than the 60s ended. One of the first things that happened is we have the Watergate crisis, where Richard Nixon resigns as president in 1972 because he was about to be found guilty of spying on the Democrats during the 1972 election, which is odd because he won that election in a landslide. OPEC, the oil crisis, and OPEC stands for oil and petroleum exporting countries in the Middle East, decide to restrict the amount of oil they're letting into the United States in response to United States support of Israel. This causes long lines at gas stations and dramatically impacts the United States economy. The gross domestic product was actually falling from 1973 to 1975 in the 1970s. So all of these things are going to really lead together and be reflected in the music. In addition, the record companies are going to start to consolidate, and they are going to start to manufacture the music more. They're going to exert their control over the music industry throughout the 1970s and 1980s. It won't be until 1990s with the grunge scene when we finally see a reaction against the commercialized top-down music industry. Gone will be the idea of the garage band and that anyone can start a band. Instead now, you are going to be expected to put on a massive, complex display both in your albums and in your concerts. So what's happening in terms of genres? Well, we have the emergence of some new genres, and most of these genres reflect these changes I've been talking about. The biggest genre that comes out of the late 60s is heavy metal. Another important genre is glam rock. And then there are some more easy listening rock styles. And then there's a new genre called prog rock or progressive rock. There are more adult styles that we'll call easy listening. Then there's the emergence of a new type of American rock, more of Americana or country-based rock, which we're going to call roots rock. Or southern rock might be another term for that. And then last we'll have punk rock. So we see in the 70s the emergence of sub-themes inside of rock and roll. While in the late 60s, almost all rock and roll was psychedelic. In the late 50s, almost all rock and roll was rockabilly. And in the early 60s, much of rock and roll was folk. In the 70s, we see a fragmentation into these different areas of rock and roll. Most of the bands in these genres you will be very familiar with. I'm going to list some of the important ones right now. The first and the biggest band of the decade was Led Zeppelin, which along with Black Sabbath, introduced the idea of heavy metal, which is a darker, heavier sound than the psychedelic rock sound. Aerosmith was another important band. We won't have time to cover them too much, but they're one of the few American metal bands that was big at the time. These bands are going to give rise to additional heavy metal bands at the end of the 70s and early 80s, which we'll be able to just touch on as we move into the 80s. Another important genre was the glam rock, and the king of glam was David Bowie, but not far behind him was Queen and Elton John. A new type of rock called progressive rock emerged, and progressive rock was much more composed rock and roll almost performed like it was classical music, where the performance is very executed and very exacting and very precise. It makes use of the recording studio and virtuistic playing by the artists. It will be surprising to you that one of the inventors and most important bands in progressive rock is Pink Floyd, especially after what we heard from them in the late 60s. Another band that we'll listen to is Rush. And as baby boomers get older, their music becomes more mature, and there emerges a new genre called easy listening rock, or easy rock. And the most important band there is Fleetwood Mac, which probably many of you know. And I would put Elton John also in that category. In the American side of things, the Eagles was a similar easy listening type of band, more mature. And their music had a kind of country roots sound to it and was influenced a lot by rural American sounds. And so the Eagles are both easy listening and what we'll call roots rock. Along with roots rock, we're going to include Creedence Clearwater Revival, which we will abbreviate with the term CCR since it's such a long name for that band. They go by that term pretty often, Creedence Clearwater Revival, John Fogerty. And then the band Lynyrd Skynyrd really introduced the idea of the southern rock style. When the psychedelic music explosion had happened, the country music world was kind of shook up. They knew they didn't want to be part of that, but they hadn't quite developed their own genre at that point. And Lynyrd Skynyrd really spoke to more rural Americans who maybe felt left behind by the Summer of Love and the psychedelic rock movements, and this allowed them to feel like rock and roll could be a rural experience as well. And then finally we have a rejection of much of this very organized, overly dramatic rock and roll sound in the punk rock movement, and the band that we'll listen to there is called the Ramones. So let's take a look at our meta themes and see how these genres and artists stack up against them. First theme, musical composition. Well, what we're going to find is the 1970s is a period of increasing complexity. With the exception of the Ramones and the punk movement, the other genres and artists are going to be producing songs and albums that are extremely complex compared to what rock and roll used to be. In some ways, rock and roll becomes orchestrated and almost like classical music. Songs range from 5 to 10 minutes long. They have many parts, many sections in them, many instruments. They're going to incorporate classical instruments. They'll incorporate world music instruments. This music will start to make a break from popular music. These bands will produce very few #1 hits compared to the Beatles in the late 60s and other rock artists like Jimi Hendrix and the Doors. These artists are going to start to sell things by the album, and their music will be expected to be listened to for long periods of time. So as you listen to this music, listen for the instrumentation, the tempo, and the meter. You'll hear the meter and the tempo change in some of these songs. You'll hear long, drawn-out solos. This is not the sort of improvisational chaos that was happening in the late 60s with Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, but more through-composed, intentional solos. For example, take a listen to the Eagles solo on Hotel California at the end. They know exactly what notes they're going to hit. Theme 2. Who's involved in this? We've been talking about the influences of black, white, rural, and urban Americans, as well as the Brits. What's going to happen in the 70s is that African Americans are no longer going to be performers or listeners to rock and roll music. Instead, white Americans will be listening to rock and roll. Generally, they will be urban, and the people performing the rock and roll will generally be British. Why do I say that? Well, I'm going to put a star by all the British bands on here. Led Zeppelin, for one. Black Sabbath. David Bowie. Queen. Elton John. Pink Floyd. And Fleetwood Mac. There was another important progressive rock band called Yes, which you don't need to know, but just to illustrate how powerful the Brits were in 70s rock, they were from Britain as well. And Rush was not from Britain, but they were from Canada. So rock and roll is performed by white Britons for white, mainly urban Americans. The remaining rock and roll in the United States was primarily that roots rock and roll style I was telling you about, which had a lot of Americana and country influence in it. And those three important bands there, the Eagles, Creedence Clearwater, and Lynyrd Skynyrd, were some of the only American bands to be selling lots of records in the 70s, along with Aerosmith at the top. In an ironic twist of fate, the Ramones were one of the first American bands to be exported back to Britain, and they started the punk rock movement. The punk rock movement was a rejection against all this complexity. It went back to a very simple style with drums, bass, guitar, and a lot of rejection of the mainstream commercial ideals. and went back to England and became very popular there, and the punk rock movement then took off in London and still exists to this day. Expectations. Is this something new and unique? Is this rebellious, or is this commercial? Is it personal? Is it mainstream? This music is very commercial and at the same time rebellious. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea is that you'd have these mega stars, and the record companies had gone out and identified primarily these major rock stars here, and were marketing and promoting them in a way that no one could compete with them. There were only 5 to 7 major record labels at the time. You and I could start a garage band and no one would ever hear of us because we could not put on a show like Led Zeppelin. We could not put on a show like Pink Floyd. There was tons of money behind these shows. Yet, at the same time, this music was not #1 hits. This wasn't music that was on the mainstream. It contrasted from disco at the time and the new pop music being played at the time. And this music was designed more to be sold by the album and to be sold for the live performance. The songs were expected to be long journeys, similar to the songs that the Beatles were producing at the end, or the Doors, where we didn't know exactly what would happen. It would be a 5 to 10 minute journey through different types of instrumentation and elements. So we grew to expect that. We grew to expect that there would be something new in the music we hadn't heard before. If we listen to Queen, you're going to hear a choir happening in it. If you listen to Elton John, suddenly we have piano. If we listen to David Bowie, we're going to have journeys through outer space. So we began to expect more complexity, but the performers know exactly what they're going to play. So the music is expected to them. They know what's going to happen, but we are taken on a journey each time, and we come to want that and expect that as well. In terms of being rebellious, the music, again, is not mainstream. It's not catered towards young audiences. This is catered towards the older baby boomers. It requires time to listen to this music. You can't just turn it on real quick like a single. And it's separating from the new music, the new 3-minute pop hits that are coming out in the 70s, produced by bands like the Bee Gees, that younger people are listening to. So this is a more mature audience. Theme 4, what is the technology that's involved and how is it affecting the music? Well, we have some new technologies that emerge. One is the mega tours with all the lights, fire, major speakers, huge crowds of 30 to 40,000 people, tour buses, large stages, and all these artists are going to become known for their tours. The music will be album-based, meaning instead of singles and #1 hits, we're expected to buy an entire album and listen to all 8 to 10 songs in it. In fact, those songs may be tied together. Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd is a perfect example of that. We will synthesizer as a new instrument. We will hear it, especially in early Pink Floyd. We'll hear it in Rush, or many of these bands will start to incorporate synthesized sound into their music. And by 1980s, the synthesizer in many ways replaces the guitar as in more popular music. Studios continue to increase in their sound quality. And so now we get the idea of like surround sound and reverberation and echoes, and the idea of automation and loops, where we don't actually have to play something. A machine will play it for us, and we can incorporate that into our sound. We do that all the time now, but this really started in the 1970s, especially with Pink Floyd again. 8-track cassettes become popular, and 8 tracks allows you to, in your car, listen to an album with up to 8 tracks on it. This is the first time that when you're driving around, you can listen to an album by somebody. AM and FM radio are now both popular. FM started to become popular in the 60s, and now it becomes the standard for listening to rock and roll. AM, on the flip side, becomes the standard for listening to popular music. So most of the popular music stations are on AM. By the 1980s, popular music will transition to FM because it sounds so much better. What's happening in society during this time? Well, the 70s were not nearly as transformative as the 60s. There weren't these massive demonstrations and changes in political culture. The 70s were a more materialistic, conservative decade than the 60s were. With OPEC and the oil crisis, cars became smaller and more conservative. People began to worry about money because of the economic downturn. The Watergate scandal caused people to begin to lose faith in our government, even more so than had been happening in Vietnam. So while we question the Vietnam War, Watergate caused a real cynicism towards our government. And by 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, one of his main phrases was, "Government is the problem." So we had lost a lot of faith in our political structures. tied in with the disco movement, which was linked more with popular music. We have a link with homosexuality in a way we hadn't before. The homosexual population begins to have an identity in the 70s and a sense of freedoms, especially in New York. That will be curtailed a fair amount in the 80s when the AIDS epidemic begins. One of the more exciting things to happen in the late 60s was we put a man on the moon. And so the early 70s, there's a lot of reference to space. Music sounds like it's in outer space. You'll hear in David Bowie and Elton John the idea of talking about Rocket Man or Space Oddity. And tied in with the OPEC oil embargo, we start to see more crisis in the Middle East that we still experience today. Iran elects the Ayatollah and moves to a more conservative Muslim government, and relationships with the United States begin to fall apart. In general, while the 60s were a generation of ideology, the 70s start to move towards a generation of more me and more materialism. Okay, let's talk real quick about these artists from the 70s that are probably the most important for you to know. Led Zeppelin, again, like I said, they are, along with Black Sabbath, the godfathers of heavy metal. And metal, along with glam rock, will replace 60s psychedelic music in the 70s. Both of these bands are from Britain. They make use of heavier lyrics. Led Zeppelin will make use of riffs. Both will make use of riffs a lot. The idea sort of introduced by the Doors and now taken in the 70s. Most of these bands will become riff-based bands, where the drums and the bass become the first thing in the song and the lyrics and melody are generally written afterwards. This is very different than the Beatles. The Beatles would often start with the melody and then build the drums and the bass around that. We're moving to a more rhythmic time that will continue until today. A lot of the music we listen to, like hip-hop, the music will be programmed first and then someone will rap over the top. So that idea is really introduced in 70s rock and roll. Creedence Clearwater Revival is an important band. They actually played at Woodstock, so they were around in the late 60s, and some of their important songs were in the late 60s, but I include them in the 70s because they represent so well that idea of that roots rock sound that's going to be coming out in the late 70s. They're a San Francisco band, but they don't sound like it. They sound like they're from Louisiana or somewhere in the South. Their music is still fairly anti-war. You won't hear a lot of the effects, wild and crazy performance techniques used by the late 60s rockers or the 70s glam rocks in Creedence Clearwater and these other roots rock bands. These bands are going to have much simpler productions. The Eagles are both a combination of easy listening and roots rock, as I described before. They are a Southern California band and become one of the biggest bands of the decade and one of the biggest American bands because most of these other bands are British. Pink Floyd somehow transforms itself from being that wild and crazy, out-of-control psychedelic band in the late 60s to one of the most technically proficient bands in the late 70s with some of the best performances. I would like you to be familiar with the song Time. And their music becomes very dark. I mean, the album is called Dark Side of the Moon. Again, in different ways than heavy metal, they will be reflecting on the dark side of life in general. And again, that sense of longing and loss that happened with the late 60s is apparent in their music. Lynyrd Skynyrd is going to popularize the idea of the Southern rock genre, which including in the roots rock sound. Their music is not going to be nearly as produced as the glam rock, heavy metal, and progressive rock sounds, but is going to have more edge than the easy listening rock. David Bowie is the forefather of glam rock, and though his peak years were in the 70s, he actually got his start way back in the 1960s. He gave the idea that rock and roll is so much more than just music and a rock star, that there should be fireworks and a big show with it, and he actually pretends like he's a man from outer space coming and landing on planet Earth. He doesn't have any #1 hits, but his career will influence much of the glam rock genre, and later when we get to the big hair heavy metal sounds in the 80s, you'll see a lot of his influence in terms of being androgynous, meaning you can't tell if he's male or female, and that influence will really come through in later artists. Queen, similarly, is going to be in the glam rock style. Big, showy concerts, showy songs, lots of different influences in it, long songs, very dramatic in their music. Rush is a band I would like you to know. Like I said, I have them here. Another important band is Yes. I left them off the list for now. Rush is a Canadian band that brings in the idea of the progressive rock, where they're playing very precisely composed music with a lot of virtuosic performance. And they will start to incorporate synthesizers and other sounds. Their biggest song, Tom Sawyer, you'll hear some of the strongest use of synthesizers in rock and roll. So Rush is a good band for you to know. Fleetwood Mac, another British band. that really epitomizes the easy listening style that was emerging in kind of adult contemporary rock and roll. And then finally the Ramones, that I'd like you to know, the Ramones are the godfathers of punk, if you will, and start that idea that to heck with all this overproduced music, let's get rock and roll back to its roots. And the Blitzkrieg Bop will show you that perfectly. You'll hear this music is very anti-establishment, anti-materialistic, and anti-production. If you look at the rock music timeline, you'll see some of the trends in the 70s that were important. Firstly, when you look at the best-selling albums worldwide, many of them are the artists that we've been talking about, either in the late 60s or early 70s. The Beatles are still a force to be reckoned with. John Lennon and Paul McCartney are putting out individual albums, and George Harrison. But you'll start to see a lot of those heavy metal bands coming in, and the progressive rock bands coming down here. We have Led Zeppelin, we have Pink Floyd, we have the Fleetwood Mac album. Rolling Stones are still putting out a lot of albums. They'll continue to do that for as long as all of us are alive. Elton John, we had talked briefly about Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young in the late 60s. More Led Zeppelin. We're going to start to get introduced to Michael Jackson, but most of the top-selling albums, as you can see from the 1970s, are dominated by rock and roll. But when we go over and look, say, at the year 1972 and start looking at the top singles for that year, we'll see that they are not the same artists. These are the popular music artists. So popular music continues to be associated with the idea of the single, and rock and roll starts to get associated with the idea of the album. These are played on AM radio, and rock and roll will then be played on FM radio. And we could look at a later year, 1975, and we see most of these are pop music artists. Frankie Valli is still even putting out music. And there is some crossover, Elton John in particular. There's still some Paul McCartney being played, but for the most part, the biggest songs of the decade are bands like ABBA and the Bee Gees. Staying Alive, top song in 1978.